Harrison's a really interesting guy. I'd never heard of him. Uh, and I only learned that he died in 2016, so not very long ago. He's Mountain Man Hemingway, I think is the best way to summarize him. Do you know a little bit about Harrison that you can kind of share with us?
Yeah, I can fill in some of the gaps. He's been a figure of some fascination of mine since I was, young, sort of naive, romantic, sensitive young man. Um, Harrison is from the Midwest originally. He's from Michigan, and he has a certain kind of Midwestern sensibility, and there's a certain pragmatism to his sort of way of approaching writing and approaching literary work. But he's also deeply romantic in the sort of capital R sense, and has a kind of lust for life, and approaches life as a feast to be devoured. And this is true of his writing, but it's also true of him as a person. um, Harrison was a poet originally, and I think he was primarily inspired by Rilke, and he's got some wonderful poems, and actually wrote a few really impressive prose poems. Uh, Letters to Yesenin is one. Yesenin was a Russian poet who died tragically. There's a sort of apocryphal story of Yesenin writing his final poem in the blood spilling from his wrist after he'd cut his wrists.
Oh wow.
And who knows if there's any truth to that. But Harrison, in a kind of depressive period in his own life, glommed onto Yesenin and wrote these incredible prose poems, sort of around some of the themes from Yesenin's work. He later started writing fiction, and actually Legends of the Fall, which is this novella that we'll talk about in a minute, I think was his first real commercial success. He'd written a few novels before that, and several since. Another one of my favorite novels is a novel he wrote called Dalva, which is interesting to me because it's from the point of view of a woman. And Harrison, I think, is the only writer I can think of who successfully pulls off writing from the point of view of someone of the opposite gender. And in Harrison's telling of this, his younger sister died when he was a child in some kind of tragic accident. I don't remember the exact details. And Harrison also, it should be mentioned, is kind of like rotund man, and he's blinded in one eye, and he sort of looks like a mythical figure if you look up pictures of him online. And he claims that in Dalva, it's like the spirit of his dead younger sister sort of speaking through him. And he's described previously writing this book in like a fugue state in which his sister is sort of like writing the novel through him. So anyway, he's sort of a fascinating figure. He was a hunter, and he was a great chef. He's got a great book on food, and some of his cooking exploits. So a guy who was sort of larger than life, and I happen to know some people who knew him in real life, and they confirm that sort of the stories and tales around this guy weren't just sort of mythology, weren't just sort of folklore, but in fact, he sort of lived many of these things. And I don't want to sort of spoil the guy's, memory, but some of these stories are pretty outrageous.
It's
So
it's
anyway,
always it's always gratifying when the man lives up to the legend.
yeah, yeah, and in sort of every sense. I mean, he's obviously a very bright guy, and in many ways was a kind of like pointy-headed intellectual, but also had this very sort of vitalistic streak to him. I don't know what else to call it. It's this sort of vitalism, this lust for life, like I said, and a real sort of spirit of adventure, and this approach to life to experience the fullness of it, which I think is reflected in the main character of Legends of the Fall. And I think you can really feel Harrison writing through this character Tristan, this, young man, his own sort of sense of himself in the world. And yeah, he's a fascinating guy in every respect.
Most definitely. So on to Legends of the Fall, right? You recommended to me to read it in one sitting, and it's a short novella. It's maybe 120 pages, something like that. Not long at all. And I'm going to pass that recommendation out to the listeners. You need to read this in one sitting. It's like going 10 rounds with Mike Tyson in some ways, but it's so gratifying when you get to the end. Even if it's not, I'd say even if it's not um, a happy ending in a conventional sense, it's an earned ending, which I think is more important than the happy ending that you get. But story starts out with the three Ludlow brothers. They are of English Cornish stock. Father, the elder Ludlow, he was a officer in the U.S. Army. Uh, he ends up leaving the army because he doesn't agree with the army's stance on what is dubbed the Indian question, which is really funny for a few different reasons. Um, so he moves out to Montana and he starts a ranch. World War One kicks off. America's not in the war yet, but these guys live so close to the Canadian border that they're able to travel to Calgary and enlist in the army. And you have the three sons: Alfred, the eldest, Tristan, the middle child, and also our main character, and then the youngest, Samuel, who is. It's funny. I talked to the Prudentialist about the brothers Karamazov on my first
Mm,
two episodes, and Samuel reminds me very much of like an Alyosha. Just
interesting.
everyone loves this guy. He's everyone's favorite person to talk to. More intellectually uh, minded than an Alyosha, but definitely just brings that life into whatever room that he walks into. He's a student at Harvard, Samuel, and where he lives with his mother, who is a Boston socialite, but sometimes visits Montana, and she's got her own thing going on that we'll get to. But just right from the get go, we have a very interesting family dynamic for the Ludlow family.
Yeah, and I think one fascinating thing about this book, to me, it's sort of reading it like you do have the characters, but it needs to be understood too that as Harrison, as the author, is like sort of fleshing them out, he has to do this in a very compressed way because of how long the book is and how much material, how much time needs to happen within the space of these 100 pages. And it's remarkable as a sort of technical matter how quickly and sort of seamlessly he draws out these sort of character archetypes of these three brothers. And let me see if I can find the exact passage, but it's almost immediately when we first meet them. In fact, when they're first introduced, you can almost tell from these two sentences almost everything you need to know about the three brothers. So if it's all right, TR, I just want to read these two sentences when we first meet the brothers, and
Go
just to
ahead. Yeah.
demonstrate sort of this remarkable sort of technical writing moment where Harrison shows us who they are in these sort of minute details. So these brothers, they're off on this quest to reach Calgary, from where they will depart and enlist in the war. And they're riding these horses, and we're in the autumn, and they're with the sort of ranch hand One Stab, who's this Indian who lives on the ranch and is, for all intents and purposes, like a member of the family. And so this is what we get from the description. Alfred, the oldest brother, said a prayer while Tristan, the middle brother, cursed and spurred his mount past Alfred and One Stab. Samuel, the youngest, dallied along with his eyes sharp on the flora and fauna. And that's it. And I mean, this may seem like a sort of trivial point, but that, as a reader, you almost slide right past that kind of description in those sentences. But in your mind, at least for me, I have this immediate sense of who these guys are, and I can almost predict just from those two sentences precisely what will happen with the rest of the novel.
And Harrison has, I mean, the term economy of words kind of gets overused, but he's definitely showing his mastery of language here, because you're right. I mean, these guys, they're archetypal characters, right? And in some sense, he's letting the reader fill in the gaps, because he knows that they'll know who these guys are just from, a couple quick sentences, right? You've got Samuel, who is the youngest and who's also just like the scientifically minded guy. He's really only in it for uh you know he's a naturalist, but not in the same way that his brother Tristan is,
Mm-hmm.
right? Tristan is sort of the wild one, the one who needs to be living off the land. Samuel is the one who's more comfortable in civilization, and then Alfred is almost like too civilized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, like the older brother, or the younger brother Samuel, literally stopping to smell the flowers in this particular point, and then we see the middle brother going out ahead of the pack, like sort of cursing and going out ahead. And then the oldest brother stopping to say a prayer. And this is as they're departing their ranch, this is as they're leaving. And I will say about the economy of words, there's something about Harrison being a poet, firstly, that I think has trained him on this economy of language. And I've noticed that some of my favorite writers are firstly poets who then become prose writers, become storytellers. And I think there's something about the practice of writing poetry that enforces this economy and enforces not just the compression of ideas, but how words, just like individual words, are operating in any given sentence. And there's just very little fluff. I mean, I don't want to go so far as to say that this novella is like word perfect, but you would be hard pressed to find language in here that is unnecessary, or that could just sort of be taken out without losing some vital sort of piece of meaning.
Definitely. No, and I think, for all the writers out there that are listening to this podcast, even if you're not writing poetry, you need to be reading it and
Mm-hmm.
studying it just to understand, because it you're 100% right, Lomez, that that economy of language, that ability to like the metaphors he uses are also just so good and so off the beaten path,
Mm-hmm.
and yet they work
Mm-hmm.
completely. And I think you're right that, I mean, this is already a short book, so I couldn't imagine an editor going in and cutting out this, that, or the other thing. But if they did, it would totally diminish the entire piece.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't. It is just there's no fat
Yeah.
in this at all.